Hello. I'd like to welcome you to our November Safe Schools webcast, Preventing and Addressing Anti-Gay Bullying. My name is Joan Lerman. I'm a school administrative consultant on the Prevention and School Violence team at the Department of Public Instruction. This month's webcast is brought to you with partnerships between Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, Office of Justice Assistance, Homeland Security Program, Wisconsin Emergency Management, Department of Health Services, and partnering organizations involved in the Center for School, Youth, and Citizen Preparedness. If you're having audio difficulties, make sure the volume is turned up. There's a volume button beneath the speaker's picture. Make sure the volume on the computer is turned up. There's a volume icon located on the right-hand side of your computer taskbar. If you're having further difficulties, contact your IT department. If audio and visual is lost during the program, go back to the DPI website and click on the Student Services Prevention and Wellness Team link on the left. Then when the Student Services Prevention and Wellness Team page of archived programs appear, select the program link desired. If problems continue to persist, contact me at 608-266-2829. Today, as I mentioned, our program is Preventing and Addressing Anti-Gay Bullying. With me today is Brian J. from GSAFE. I'll introduce him to begin our program, and then he'll introduce the other speakers. Brian.
Awesome. Thanks, Joan. And welcome, everybody. My name is Brian J. I'm the Program Director for the Gay Straight Alliance for Safe Schools. GSA for Safe Schools is an organization based here in Madison, but works with students and educators around the state, really to help develop student leadership, as well as work with educators to make schools a place where all students can thrive, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. I'm working with a scratchy throat. I've been training all weekend, so hopefully I don't lose my throat as we're working through this. I have two other guests that you'll see in just a little bit. Their names are Michael Matthijs and Andy Algar, who are two great students that I've had the chance to work with. I want to start when we're talking about gay and lesbian issues. Oftentimes we hear a lot of vocabulary words and a lot of acronyms, and so I just wanted to break down the acronym just a little bit. Although I want to let folks know ahead of time that when you're talking about LGBT issues, the vocabulary is often changing and emerging, so what you might know now might change. And also that there's not always agreement within the LGBTQ community as far as like word usage and terminology and identity. And to also recognize that some of that terminology is culturally specific and community specific. So, for instance, a lot of the terms have been developed by more of a white LGBT community, and so communities of color might use some different words and terminology. And I'll try to share those as we go along. So the first one is just simply gay, which is generally an umbrella term, usually referred to people who have the ability to fall in love with or be attracted to people of the same sex. It's often used to describe gay men as well. The next word is lesbian, which is a term for two women who are either physically or emotionally attracted to each other. Contrary to some people that I work with, gay men cannot be lesbians, but that's a term. Sometimes I get asked that question, so lesbian is a female-specific term. Although I do want to point out that in some communities, other terms might be same-gender loving, and also like they don't differentiate between lesbian, bisexual. It's like either you're gay or you're not gay. Another term is bisexual, which is a term that you've probably heard quite a bit. Bisexual refers to someone who has the capacity to fall in love and be attracted to someone of either gender or either sex. A common myth that's out there is that if you're bisexual that you have to be in a relationship with somebody of both genders or both sexes at the same time, and we know that that's not accurate and not true and has been really stigmatizing for folks who identify as bisexual. The next term is transgender, which is really an umbrella term to refer to somebody whose sense of self, like sense of their gender identity, is different from the biological sex that they were assigned at birth. And really that's, to get too much deeper into it right now is really a whole other workshop, although I'm going to talk about it in a little bit more depth in just a moment. But to recognize that transgender is an umbrella term for a large number of students out there. Two other terms that you might encounter are questioning, which really just means that someone's not sure about what their sexual orientation or gender identity is at the moment. One thing I want to point out about questioning is that there's data out there that talks about that when a student is in that questioning phase of their identity development, that's actually the time where they're oftentimes most vulnerable to anti-gay bullying and harassment. What we know is that when they're a lot more sure and confident in their identity, they have some more of those resiliency skills. But when they're at that questioning stage, when they don't know and they don't know what kind of support they have, that's when they're really vulnerable to anti-gay bullying and harassment. So just something to think about there. The last term is queer. I know that I grew up playing games called Smear the Queer, where queer was not a good term, but what I know is that queer has oftentimes been reclaimed by members of the LGBTQ community, oftentimes younger LGBTQ folks, to take back that power that's been used against them. So sometimes you'll have young people that you're working with who identify as queer, and judging from the context that they're using that word, you'll be able to identify, oh, they're using that as a sense of empowerment versus using it in a way that's pejorative or hurtful. So to break down some of those components, so those were some of the terms. Those by far aren't all the terms, but I want to break down some pieces that go into everyone's identity, but particularly when we're thinking about sexual orientation and gender identity, there's some elements I think are important to think about. The first one is biological sex, and when a child is born, or even before a child is born in our culture, what's that first question that people have, before anything else is asked? And it's usually, what gender, what's the sex of the baby? People want to know, is that child a boy or is that child a girl? And what we know about biological sex is that it isn't as black and white as that all the time. As you can see, there's a spectrum here. On one end we have people who would identify as male, and people that we would identify as female on the other end. But we know is that sometimes differences in anatomy, or a child is born with ambiguous anatomy, also times differences in chromosomes or the way that a child responds to hormones. What we know is that there are some individuals in our culture, in our society, who are born not necessarily completely male or not completely female. A term that's used for that now is intersex. Folks that have been around a little bit longer might remember the term hermaphrodite. That's a term that has been used in the past, but folks who are intersex don't consider particularly supportive. So a term that we use is intersex when we're thinking about that. So when we're thinking about biological sex, it isn't just as clear as just simply being male and female. The next component that I like to talk about is gender. And again, we have a number of spectrums here. The first one I want to talk about is gender roles, which is society's expectation of gender. So, in our culture, we have people, and we have an idea about what does it mean to be male and what does it mean to be female, and we often associate that with biological sex. But those gender roles are actually separate from that. The next spectrum that I want to talk about is gender expression. In other words, how you communicate your gender. So, for instance, were someone to walk through the door right now into this room, what I might try to notice is, I might look at, well, what are they wearing? Are they dressed in what clothes that I associate with men? Are they wearing something that I associate with females? Do they have facial hair? How is their hair done? How do they use their voice? How do they walk? How do they express themselves? That's what we're getting at when we're talking about gender expression. And so we have things in our culture that we consider to be very masculine ways of expressing our gender, which can be, being strong or being into sports or presenting ourselves in that way. We also have things that we associate with being feminine, which can include, dress and interest and what we talk about. And what we know is that, along that spectrum, there's a lot of people who end up being very androgynous or taking on masculine and feminine characteristics. Finally, we have gender identity, which is that psychological sense of self, or as one of my colleagues likes to call it, it's your brain gender, which can be a little bit hard to think about, but some ways that it's explained is to, when you look in a mirror, you can kind of see who you are as a gendered person, and you might notice your biological sex. But when you close your eyes and think about who am I as a person, that's kind of that's that brain gender, that's that gender identity that we're talking about. Do you see yourself as a man? Do you see yourself as a woman? And for some people that's really clear, some people that's not so clear, and for some people that sense of gender identity doesn't match up with their biological sex. And that's when we start moving into the territory of people who might identify as either gender non-conforming or gender queer might be another term, or transgender, among a number of different terms. The last identity slide that I want to share with you is sexuality, which I want to be clear that sexuality is different than gender. So transgender individuals aren't necessarily gay or lesbian or bisexual, and gay, lesbian, bisexual people aren't necessarily transgender either, although it goes, that mixes. So sexuality, so sexual orientation, that's that romantic or sexual attraction that people have to each other. And, that can be same-sex, being attracted to people of primarily the same sex. It could be bisexual or also asexual. There are some people who don't find themselves attracted to anybody, or very few people. And then we also have people who are attracted to the opposite sex. So that attraction runs the spectrum of our experience. We also have sexual expression, which is that sexual behavior. It's like what you do and who you do it with. And that also can be, expressing yourself sexually with people of the same sex, being open to expressing yourself with people of both sexes, or primarily expressing yourself with people of the opposite sex. And the last piece is sexual identity. In other words, who I tell you that I am. And for some folks, they might tell you that they're gay or lesbian. Some folks might say, I'm bisexual. And other folks might say that they're heterosexual or straight. And the thing I want to point out here is, especially as we're thinking about working with young people, is that sexual orientation, who you're attracted to, sexual expression, who you either have sex with or have sexual experiences with, don't always line up with who you identify, like how you identify yourself. So for instance, you may be working with someone who identifies as a heterosexual male in your school, and yet might have attractions to both sexes and might be having sexual relationships with people of the same sex. And so as you think about some of the messages or some of the things you're talking about, particularly in health class or in other areas, recognizing that you might have people that are identifying as heterosexual, but actually might be experiencing something very different from that. So identification and actual attraction doesn't always match up. Just want to share a couple of vocabulary pitfalls. One of the things is to not confuse sexual identity with sexual expression. I've had a number of occasions, including a middle school here in Madison, where people confused a student saying that I'm gay with saying that I'm sexually active. What we know is that people can be very much aware of who they're attracted to at a very early age and come to that sense of, identifying who they are, whether that's identifying as heterosexual or as gay, as lesbian, or bisexual. That doesn't mean that they're sexually active. So especially if you're thinking, if you're talking with a young person and they disclose that they're gay or lesbian, you don't necessarily have to be concerned with mandatory reporting laws or having to report that to somebody. Unless they tell you that they're sexually active, you don't need to assume that they are. I also wanted to talk about some terms to avoid. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but some terms that when I talk with other gay people, some of the terms that kind of raises their hackles or get them a little bit worked up include terms like phase, or choice, or lifestyle, and preference. And what I know, like for myself as a gay male, I know that, I didn't wake up this morning and say, oh, I need some caffeine and I'm going to be gay. And sometimes there's that perception out there that somebody just kind of flippantly decided who they are. And to refer to it as, as a choice and a lifestyle, most folks would say, this is something that they're very, it's something that they've been aware of for a long time, and it's been a process to come to that. So, if you make that mistake and use some of those terms and you're working with a young person, they kind of recoil or step back, it's a great opportunity to be like, you know what, I just used a term that doesn't seem to work well with you. Is there a term that you would use, or can you help me understand that, be open to learning from the people that you're working with and being receptive to using some different language. All right, so hopefully that was significant enough primer in LGBT 101. We recognize that it's not everything that you need to know, but I want to just give you a kind of a foundational understanding of some of the vocabulary that we use. I want to actually transition to the topic that we're talking about, which is anti-gay bullying. And I want to go through some slides and some information about what type of anti-gay bullying is happening, primarily in Wisconsin schools. I have some national data, but I also want to draw from a Wisconsin school climate survey that my organization did in 2009. So one of the things that we know is that anti-gay bullying is very verbal, and it's happening frequently. The majority of Wisconsin youth experience verbal harassment due to their sexual orientation or gender identity. I hear this all the time. And we also know that nearly 3/4 of Wisconsin youth hear "that's so gay" frequently or often. And sometimes when, and I'm sure many of us have had this instance where when we've chosen to, when we hear "that's so gay" or people use something like that and we want to intervene, we'll often get that pushback from young people as well as adults that say, I didn't mean it like that. I just meant, that's dumb, and you're taking it too personally. You're getting all worked up about it. It's not what I mean. What we know is that when we ask Wisconsin youth how they feel about terms like "that's so gay," we know that 75% of them say it significantly bothers or distresses them when they hear gay used in a derogatory way. So, when you're working with young people that feel really strong about using that language, it might be good to really challenge them to step out of their shoes and think about what it might be like to be that person that's hearing that on a regular basis, or to ask them why they're so latched on to using that language. What about that language they really like to use, and might there be some other words that we can use? So we talked about the verbal harassment. We also know that anti-gay bullying is physical. 25% of Wisconsin youth have been physically harassed because of their sexual orientation, 21% because of their gender expression. And of course, physical violence can include personal violence, such as being shoved or hit or physically assaulted. It can also be damage and vandalism to personal property. For instance, vandalism to a school locker, theft. If you're working with a gay youth and they say, I've had stuff stolen, it might not just be a typical theft. It might be targeting them with anti-gay bullying harassment. So recognizing that physical is more than like assaults on the body. We also know that transgender and gender nonconforming youth experience more incidents of harassment and assault due to their sexual orientation, their gender, and their gender expression. So, they're also a very vulnerable community as well. The other thing that we know is educators don't always intervene. A quarter of Wisconsin youth report that faculty and staff never intervene when homophobic remarks are made in their presence. And I know, I've been out in schools many times. I'm often in the classroom, and I know that educators are making about 30 decisions a minute. So, for instance, that student over there, you can hear them call somebody a fag or say "that's so gay," and you want to say something, but then suddenly there's a fight going on over here, or people are getting worked up, and so you focus your attention over here, and so we know it's hard, and we know that it's hard to be on top of everything. But what our students are telling us is that when staff are around, a lot of them aren't intervening or speaking up. And we also know, and this next statistic is from the 2007 GLSEN National School Climate Survey. GLSEN is a national organization working on similar issues. But we know that 2/3 of LGBT youth report hearing homophobic remarks from faculty or school staff. So it's not just them hearing it from their peers, but it's hearing it from adults. And so think about kind of that, when somebody that you trust or rely on for support is actually using that language, oftentimes offhandedly, when they're using that impact that it can have. So thinking about impact, there's a number of ways that anti-gay bullying and harassment impact in negative ways on students. One of the things that I like to point out is that students who are harassed because of their real or perceived sexual orientation or gender expression report having a lower grade point average than their peers who aren't harassed or harassed less often. And the 2009 GLSEN National School Climate Survey points out, 2.7 versus 3.1, which we know in this day and age that, that difference between, 3.0 and under 3.0 makes a difference as far as students' academic future as far as going on to college. And of course, we want all of our students to be doing well academically. So, just this statistic alone should remind us that, if we want our schools to be successful schools and achieving schools, if we have a population that's doing worse academically, that's a good enough reason to start trying to remedy that the situation that's happening in our schools. We also know that there's positive things when students are able to identify supportive staff members. So, for instance, if they can identify at least one supportive staff, they're much more likely to report feeling like they belong at their school. If they can identify a supportive staff person, they're more likely to express that desire to go on to post-secondary education and a whole number of other things as well. And I do want to point out that nearly half of Wisconsin LGBT youth report that they feel unsafe in school because of their sexual orientation. So if you think about that, if people are spending, half of our youth feel unsafe, think about where their attention goes when they're worried about where the next insult is going to come from or the next that's so gay is going to come from, and how that makes them very unavailable for learning in the classroom and in the school. All right. So another thing that I want to point out as far as the impact of anti-gay bullying is that we're not just talking about gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender students. And that's something that I think, when I work with schools around the state, something I really try to point out is it's not just our gay students are hurting, it's actually all of our students. What we know is that 4 out of 5 students who are harassed on account of perceived sexual orientation are actually heterosexual, so it's not just our gay students. And the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, so DPI, in their Youth Risk Behavior Survey, they asked a really interesting question between 1997 and 2001, and that question was, they asked a question to all students, asking them if you've been threatened or hurt because someone thought you were gay, lesbian, or bisexual, as opposed to, students identifying themselves as gay, lesbian, or bisexual. So again, they're asking students, have you been threatened or hurt because someone thought you were gay, lesbian, or bisexual? And what was interesting in that is that for the students who answered yes, we don't know their sexual orientation, but for the folks that said yes, we know that they're at a much greater risk for a whole number of risk factors. And I know you can see the slide right now that kind of points out some of the areas where those students who said yes were at much greater risk. And so, when we're thinking about, what can we do in our school, or if we're working with, a school board or administrators or parents or other teachers that say, we don't have any of those students here at our school, I think it's really important to go back to this information and say, you know what, all of our students are dealing with this type of bullying. It's happening here at our school. I want to share 2 stories. I know that this past September, for folks that might have been plugged into Facebook or paying attention to the news, there's been a whole number of suicides by students who identify as gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender. Among those, we have folks like Billy Lucas, Alicia Hassan, Tyler Clementi, Seth Walsh, Raymond Chase, Asher Brown, Cody Barker, who is a student that we've worked with here in Wisconsin from Shiacton. He died by suicide in September. And then also countless unreported and underreported young people, and particularly young females as well as students of color. Their stories aren't necessarily always being told in the media. But I want to actually go back a year. A year ago in April, there were other stories in the news, and these were 2 that really caught my attention. The first is, I'm going to start with Eric Mohat, who 17 years old from Ohio, a junior in high school. Through high school, he'd been teased by his classmates, oftentimes called gay, and picked on for being perceived as a gay male. And the harassment got so bad that one day in school he was told by a classmate while everyone is in the classroom that, why don't you just go home and shoot yourself? No one will miss you. And Eric that day actually did go home, and he got a gun and he shot himself, and he was dead. And the thing that I want to point out with Eric is that he never identified as gay. His classmates decided, you know what, we're going to pick on him. We know that calling him a gay is going to be hurtful, and that's what we're going to do. And that type of bullying resulted in a young person killing themselves. And that happened back in 2007. Moving on to Carl Joseph Walker Hoover, 11-year-old, so middle school student in Massachusetts. We know that he was a Boy Scout. We know that he was involved in football. I'm not sure if he enjoyed football or not, but we know that he played football. And he too was the target of anti-gay bullying and harassment at his school, and repeated anti-gay harassment and bullying. And the bullying got so bad that one day last April, he returned from school, went up to his room. His mother was cooking dinner, and when she called him to come down for dinner, he didn't come down, and so his mother went up to his room, and what she found is that she had found Carl had hung himself in his closet because the bullying had gotten so bad. And again, Carl didn't identify as gay. We don't know what his sexual orientation was, but he hadn't identified as gay. And so again, it's like I really want to drive home the point that we're not just talking about gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgender students, and we definitely should be talking about them, but this topic impacts all students, and so it's imperative that schools address this situation. I'm going to shift a little bit into laws. So, we're hearing the stories, we're hearing the impact. I want to talk about some of the tools that you have as educators and school officials to take action and start making positive change and making it better for your students. So I'm going to start with some state laws. So here in Wisconsin, we have the Pupil Non-Discrimination Law, also known as State Statute 11813. And essentially what that says, and you can look it up on the DPI website, and most schools should, by law, they should actually have it on their own policies. But the Pupil Non-Discrimination Law says schools cannot exclude students from a curricular or non-curricular activities or programs on the basis of sexual orientation. We don't yet have protections based on gender identity. There's a number of states around the country who also explicitly protect students on the basis of gender identity expression. We don't have that yet in Wisconsin, although there's a number of school districts around the state who have added gender identity to their non-discrimination policy independent of state law. So we have that law, and schools need to have a written policy, and it often shows up, in student handbooks or policy handbooks. Sometimes it'll show up online. Schools are required to make a public statement of that each year. But the thing that we know is, and for folks, watching, something that you can ask yourself is, how often do you read your staff handbook from cover to cover? Have you memorized that staff handbook? I'm guessing that most people are going to say no. So something to think about when we're talking about laws is to recognize that written policies are great, but we have to think about how do we make those alive and how do we share those. And I'll talk about that in a little bit, but the other thing that schools need to have with this law is that schools need to have a complaint process that's easily available to students, their families, as well as community members. Most schools are required by law to have a designee that's going to receive those complaints and then act upon them. I wanted to point out that DPI also has an administrative code that interprets 118.13. What I like about the administrative code is that it includes harassment under the definition of discrimination, because sometimes people say, well, harassment or bullying isn't discrimination, but I feel like the administrative code clearly spells out that if it's harassment, then that's discrimination, and that's illegal in the state of Wisconsin. We also recently passed Wisconsin's anti-bullying law, which schools are now required to have a written policy and complaint process, very similar to the non-discrimination law. I want to talk about a couple of federal laws that are important when we're talking about LGBT youth in schools. We have the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which essentially says that schools have a constitutional duty to protect LGBT students from harassment on an equal basis with all other students. In other words, if a school is going to protect one group of students, they need to protect all students equally. Wisconsin, back in the mid-90s, actually had a case that went to court on this issue that set a national precedent. So back in the mid-90s, a student in Ashland, Wisconsin by the name of Jamie Nabosny, starting in middle school, had been started experiencing anti-gay harassment and bullying from his classmates. It started out with verbal bullying, and as that was happening, Jamie and his parents were going to school administrators asking for help. That the bullying continued, and as he got to high school, and as he came out as a gay male, the bullying started before he identified as a gay male. But as he got older and as he progressed through high school, the bullying became physical, which included being urinated on by classmates in a urinal, being mocked, raped by his classmates, and kind of that last piece that really, the straw that broke the back, was being attacked by his classmates and kicked so hard that he had to go to the hospital for internalized bleeding. Jamie, not surprisingly, decided that this was not a safe place for him. He ran away from school or from home twice to seek safer places. The thing that I want to point out about Jamie's story is that along the way, there were definitely wonderful educators in Ashland who were trying to be supportive. But as it was going up through the process, there would be school administrators, both at the middle and high school, who essentially would tell Jamie and his family that, you know, if you're going to be like that, if you're going to be gay, this is what you can expect, and what do you want us to do about it? And eventually what happened is that Jamie and his family decided to sue the school district. It went up and it got repealed, and then it, or knocked down, and then it appealed. Eventually, working their way through the system, a court found the 3 individual administrators in the school district who had failed to protect Jamie. They found them liable for almost $1 million in damages for not protecting Jamie under the 14th Amendment, or the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which, as folks may remember, people around the state as well as around the country stood up and kind of took notice and said, oh, we need to be taking this seriously. And so that was a really important case that set a national precedent. Other federal laws, we also have Title IX, which I often think about in relationship just to female students having access to equal opportunities. But what's great about Title IX additionally is that it prohibits gender-based harassment, including harassment due to a student's failure to conform to stereotyped notions of masculinity and femininity. So if we go back to that slide where I talked about gender expression, how that student, like how a biologically male student would express his gender, if he's not acting like the right kind of boy, or if a girl isn't acting feminine enough, Title IX can be used to protect students who are experiencing harassment around that, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And the last law that I wanted to talk about is the Equal Access Act, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit more in detail a little bit later, but this is a law that was passed to essentially ensure that students who wanted to have Bible clubs in schools had a protected right to do that. And what's happened is that the law, the act that says schools must allow, if a school allows one non-curricular club to exist, then they need to allow all non-curricular clubs to exist. What's been great is that GSAs have actually used that again and again to say, hey, you need to allow us to form, and you also need to treat us. So you need to treat us equally. So I'm getting tired. So, and you know, and this is great. What's really frustrating is that on a month-to-month basis, still here in Wisconsin, we are continuously encountering schools that try to maneuver or figure out some way to not allow students to form GSAs, which under the Equal Access Act, that feels like that's illegal, and schools are acting outside of the law when they're doing that. And so one of the things I really want to encourage folks who are listening to remember is that students have a right to form GSAs. They have a right to call it a gay-straight alliance. They don't have to call it a diversity club or an equity club. They get to call it a gay-straight alliance, and they get to meet, and they get to be treated exactly the same way as other non-curricular clubs in your school. So my last slide before I pass it over to Michael and Andy, I want to talk a little bit about professional responsibility. And, you know, educators have a responsibility to support all students in their classrooms, regardless of their personal feelings or beliefs, which I know can be really hard. But the thing that I want to remind people, educators, is that you get to have your personal beliefs about gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people. You get to have that. But professional responsibility, whether that's professional organizations or state laws or federal laws, clearly make the case that students, all students deserve support in your classroom. There's a great video called It's Elementary by an organization called GroundSpark. There's a wonderful moment in that video where an elementary school teacher talks about her experience, and she talks about how her community, as well as her religion, says that, or say that being gay is wrong or is not an acceptable thing. But she knows that in her classroom, she needs to make sure that she's supporting all students, including students who have same-sex parents. And so she talks about how when she's talking about families in the classroom, she makes sure that when they're talking about families, that they include books and videos that show all types of families, including families that have 2 moms or 2 dads. And that's a really beautiful example of somebody recognizing, here's my feelings, but what's my professional responsibility to make sure all students feel safe and available for learning in the classroom. So support means being very intentional about it, being inclusive and working to affirm youth and their families. And also support is not simply just feeling sorry or simply tolerating students. It means being very active in providing that support. So that's enough of me for a little while. I've been talking for a while. I would like to introduce my two student guests who are going to be helping me out and sharing their stories. Michael Matthijs, who will share where he's from, and also Andy Algar. Both students have worked with me over the past few years in student leadership positions.
Okay, like Brian said, my name is Michael. I come from a small town in the Fox Valley, or the Fox Cities. It's about 5,000 people. It's pretty small, and I want to tell you about my coming out story, and then a little bit about how we tried to start a GSA. I guess in high school I always felt like I didn't belong. It was hard because it seemed like all the students were against me. None of them were supportive, and that was my experience, as I thought that no one supported me. So it took me a while to come to terms with myself and how I would come out to other students. I actually came out to a teacher first. She always told me she would tell the whole class how she was supportive of her gay best friend, and it was great just to know that she was supportive. And so I remember I was sitting in her office and I told her, and she was really supportive of me, and she canceled one of her meetings and just kind of talked to me about it, and it was a really, really good experience to just know that someone was supportive of me. And she encouraged me to come out to other students. I came out to students one at a time. It was kind of like practice for when I was going to come out to my main group of friends, because I was really scared that I was going to lose them. We didn't really talk much about gay stuff, but when it did come up, I remember one friend in particular, she would always say how she's against it, her religion's against it, her family's against it, and she's not supportive of gay people. And so I kind of thought that all my friends thought that way, and so I was really afraid to come out to my main group of friends. But when I did, it felt really good. It was just like a weight lifted off my shoulders. I did lose that one friend, which is unfortunate, but my main group of friends I was really lucky to have, because they stood by me and they were always supportive of me, and that was really great. Once I kind of was out, I got used to being out. I was ready to start a GSA at my school because I thought that other students felt the same way. So we talked to the principal. It was myself and one of my other friends who really wanted to start this GSA. So we set up a couple of meetings with the principal, and he was very supportive of us. But he was worried about what the parents would say. He was afraid that we'd get angry phone calls or angry emails yelling at him for supporting this gay group. So we actually had to set up a meeting with the superintendent, which we were both really scared and really excited for, because we were nervous because we didn't want to say anything wrong, but we were also excited because we thought, well, there's no way he can deny us, because we have all these reasons why it's a good idea, and how could he say no to us? Well, we got into that meeting, and he asked me why does this town need a GSA? And I told him a bit about what we had planned out to say, and I got one or two sentences in, and he cut me off. He told me how the parents wouldn't accept it, a lot of the faculty and staff weren't going to accept it. He talked about what they do for other minority groups, like handicapped people, ethnic groups, and that my town was very supportive of that, but they didn't have room for a GSA, and it wasn't a priority because there just wasn't enough people to support us. And I just thought it was really heartbreaking just to hear that. We were so excited, we were so ready to kind of push this through, and eventually we did get one started. I left. I graduated before it was actually an official group, but so it was kind of unfortunate that I didn't get to see what happened with all my work. But we did get it started, but they weren't allowed to call it a GSA. they had to call it an equality group, which was unfortunate. I guess some advice that I wanted to leave for educators is that the best thing that you can do is show that you're a supportive ally, and show that you support gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgender students. And it's pretty simple. All you have to do is like just leave little stories. Like I know my band teacher always told us about her gay friend, and like it wasn't even during class. It was like just kind of when we were just talking, just hanging out. And a lot of my other teachers taught gay history, or they would have gay people in math problems even. It was just kind of interesting how that kind of stuff could get worked into the curriculum, and it's very uplifting to know that there's at least one person there that supports you and you can talk to. I think that's it. That's all I have to say. So I'm going to pass it on to Andy, and she's going to tell you her story.
All right. My name's Andy. I'm a senior at Oregon High School, and I'm a lesbian. And my story is pretty opposite of Michael's in many ways, but it all leads back to bullying. And I came out as a lesbian when I was a freshman, and it went pretty well. You know, like I wasn't really afraid to be who I was, and it's mainly because I came out at school first. I came out feeling very comfortable because I had the entire GSA supporting me, and it wasn't just that the GSA supported me, it's that the school supported the GSA. And I think that that was really important in our GSA's growth and development as a group, because the atmosphere that we have so much room to grow because we have so much support. Unfortunately, all of the work that our GSA does to end the cycle of ignorance isn't doing enough in our school, because in the hallways I hear things that are just completely unnecessary. I hear comments, anti-gay comments, that people probably don't even realize affect students, you know, and I feel like there's so much more that we could be doing, you know, and I feel that educators, as much as they say that they want to stop bullying, as much as they say that they want to, you know, put an end to, you know, hateful remarks and stuff, are not doing as much as they could be doing, because as much as I hear what these kids are saying, I don't hear anybody speaking up. And the thing is, when it's your own peers, it's scary. It's really scary to call someone out on something that hurts you, because you're afraid that you'll be judged. You're afraid that someone will just completely, you know, like that it'll backfire, you know. And where teachers come in is that they have a voice and they have authority. And even though I don't see many teachers roaming the halls like we do, if there was just like a few times where I've seen a positive action made, an example put in the halls where teachers have called out someone for saying that someone was a faggot, that someone was gay, and just really set an example, a positive example, where students can see that and understand that it's not okay, and understand that you can be accepted if you are LGBTQ, whatever you are. It would just be such a positive change. And that's not just in my school. I mean, I can't speak for Berlin High or, you know, Madison West, but I mean, I can only assume that it's the same thing going on in the halls. I hear more derogatory remarks said in the halls more than anywhere that I've ever heard them. Not in the mall, not in the classrooms. You know, like kids might say stupid things in the classrooms, but it's quiet and teachers don't hear that. But I hear that, and other kids hear that too. And, you know, just calling someone out once, something could click. Someone could change. Someone's life could be saved by you just, you know, making that one smart, proactive choice to try and end the cycle of hate, because hate is not a value that we can afford to have. It's not helpful. It's not encouraging. It sucks, you know? like that's really all that it is. So my advice for educators is really just to step up and, you know, do the best that you can to call it as you hear it. You know, when you hear something, don't let it slide. Because the time that you let it slide may be the time that something even worse comes from it, you know? So just be the change, you know? It can start with you and then it can end with you. So now I'll turn it back to Brian so he can
Awesome.
do the rest of his deal.
Awesome. Thank you, Andy and Michael. You did a great job. All right, so Andy and Michael actually started to identify some of the things that I wanted to share with you as far as just some really basic steps that you can take to start making it better in your school and community. Want to go back briefly to thinking about the law, and I think one of the things that's been really powerful in the work that we've done with student leaders across the state is educating students about their rights under the law, as well as the reporting process. We're actually, sometimes I'm surprised and not surprised to find out that students are often unaware of the fact that they have laws that protect them. Again, it goes back to that, a policy is only as good as, the shelf that the book that it's in is on. And so it's really important and imperative for schools to be really proactive about educating students about the rights that they have and the laws that are protecting them. Because we know that students who are aware of laws that protect them are less likely to skip class or school. They're more likely to say that they feel safe. And so that can be, at the start of, not just at the start of the class or the school year, but oftentimes throughout the school year, reminding students, having a discussion in your classroom and saying, it's not okay to harass people on a whole number of reasons at our school, including because someone thinks they're gay or lesbian or that they are gay or lesbian, and being very clear about that and not being worried about using those words, because the reality is it's illegal to harass and bully someone on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. So it's important to be educating students that they have that right to be safe. When you, as far as your reporting process, you need to really make sure that it's clear about how to get the forms, who you turn the forms into, and what that can be expected after a person turns in the form. I've worked with schools or families where I've had to call several offices in a school just to find out where do you get the forms and who do you report them to. And it should be something as simple as going into like the class office or the school office or even the classroom and asking, I need a harassment form. Please take reports seriously. It takes a lot of courage. I think Andy and Michael talked about how hard it is sometimes. It takes a lot of courage to go to an adult and say, you know what, I don't feel safe, I'm being harassed, particularly if it's, the student may or may not be out as gay or lesbian, bisexual, or transgender, or might be embarrassed that they're being targeted by that type of harassment. So, when you get those reports, take them seriously. And, obviously, through the process as you're reporting, investigating, obviously you can't share everything with the student who made the report because of privacy concerns for the students that may be involved. But really encourage those students who make that report to report further incidents of violence as they occur if it's happening as you're investigating. And again, you really want to hear from your students. James Howe, from my generation, he was the author who wrote Bunnicula, but for the current generation, you might be more familiar with his writing. He wrote the book The Misfits, which gave rise to No Name Calling Week, which some schools might engage in. But he had made a comment one time about if you're not hearing from your gay, lesbian, and bisexual and transgender students, then you definitely have a problem. We know that they're out there. You absolutely want to hear from them. It's not a matter of if the bullying is happening, but it's a matter of where and when and to whom. So we know it's happening in all schools. As Andy was talking about, as well as Michael, but the importance of addressing anti-gay harassment and bullying as you hear it. And again, we know that sometimes it happens out of earshot. Students are really good at harassing outside of the range of educators. One strategy that you might use is you might want to ask your students where they hear and where they see anti-gay name calling and bullying, and you can do something as simple as getting a map of your school and having students make a check mark on where they've heard or seen it to help you figure out where that's happening, particularly out of earshot of educators. But one of the things that can be really helpful for educators is as a staff, so this is a great opportunity for administrators to take a lead here. As a staff, decide that you're going to come up with a common language about how you're going to respond to anti-gay bullying harassment when you hear it. I know from talking with educators that oftentimes they're worried about being that one teacher who's known in the school as, Miss Smith is always going to call me out, and so, I know not to say it there, but I can say it in the hallway or in the other classroom or in the bus or whatever else have you. It's really helpful and empowering to educators to have everyone on the same page, knowing how they're going to respond when they hear something, and knowing that their colleagues are going to have their back, and they're not going to be putting themselves putting their neck out to be that only teacher that's addressing this issue. So it can be really helpful to do that. And my colleague Bonnie Augusta, formerly of the Madison School District, created a great workshop around that, which I'd be happy to share with folks. Another really simple, quick strategy that folks can use, so as you're developing that common language, a strategy that I learned from students at Middleton High School, Middleton Cross Plains High School, over a decade ago, is a strategy called Name It, Claim It, Stop It, and Bonnie and I have added Walk Away in the years since. But it works like this. So say, and I'm going to pick on Joan, who's sitting to the right of me here, who I don't think you can see, but for instance, I just heard Joan say, call somebody gay in the hallway. So the way that Name It, Claim It, Stop It works is I would say, hey, Joan, I just heard you call somebody gay. You know what? That's not appropriate in this school, or, I have family members who are gay, and when you say something like that, that's really hurtful, and so I don't want you to say that anymore. And that's your intervention. It's quick, it's simple, you've named it, you've claimed it, and you've stopped it. The other piece is to walk away. You're not having an argument. You're just simply making that point. You've quickly educated. Because oftentimes when you do that, people are going to be like, well, I didn't mean it, or, well, that's not how I meant for it to come out, or stop being sensitive. But you're not having an argument. You're just having a brief moment where you're letting people know, hey, that's not cool. And of course it seems really easy to do, when I'm talking about it, but when you actually try it for the first or second or third or fourth time, it might not come out quite the way that you want it to come out, but keep at it. So it does make a difference, and it starts to address some of those things that the students talked about. I also want to point out that there's a really great resource online. It's called Zero Indifference. It was written by Nancy Goldstein, formerly of GLSEN, but I believe currently with the Anti-Defamation League. But what it does is it takes Name It, Claim It, Stop It, and expands it so that it helps you think about what can you do when this happens when there's a lot of students around versus when it's more in private. You can have a conversation with a student in private. Or, if you have a lot of time or if you have no time. Because there's times where all you can do is say, hey, stop! And that's the most that you can do at that moment. And so she takes you through some different strategies that you can use, as well as what you can do to follow up with the student when you have a little bit more time to have a conversation. Another great resource out there is an article called Addressing Homophobic Behavior in the Classroom by Alan Horowitz. And I always forget if he's with the Minneapolis or St. Paul School District. But it's a great article. It's just a 2-page article talking about how he's addressed the inappropriate use of the word gay at the elementary school level. So it's an elementary school teacher talking about how to have these conversations at the elementary school level. And it's a great resource. Andy and Michael both talked about GSA, so I want to talk a little bit about just how you can help students make it better now. As they both mentioned, support student efforts to form GSAs and engage the school community through GSAs. I feel like I've talked about that a bit already, but again, if students want to start a GSA, help them in doing that. If you think there are students who would like to have a GSA and something's not at your school yet, there's nothing that says that you can't tap their shoulder or tap the shoulder of a student that that's concerned about social justice issues and say, hey, I was just watching this webcast about GSAs, and, what do you think about having one of those here? And then working with them through the process, as well as support GSAs, in the work that they're doing in the schools. So, if they're planning an event that's appropriate for the school setting, support them and allow them access as much as is appropriate in the school. The one thing I do want to say about GSAs is that they're not the end-all be-all answer for LGBT youth. One of the things that we know is that not every gay and lesbian, bisexual, and transgender student goes to GSA, even if there is one. We also know that GSAs tend to be very white in their student makeup, and so it's really important to think about how else are we meeting the needs of our LGBT youth of color. GSAs aren't, aren't the end-all be-all. And so there's other steps that schools can take to support students, which could include, a more below-the-radar support group or counseling group or alternative ways to bring students together that might not be as visible or as high profile as a GSA. But what we do know about GSA is that students in schools with a GSA experience less victimization related to their sexual orientation or gender identity. Those students are less likely to report that they feel unsafe and are more likely to report a sense of connectedness to the school, which is great, which is let alone a great reason to have a GSA. Students are connected and they want to be at school. I've heard stories where the only reason a student comes to school is because they know that GSA is on Wednesday, and so they're going to be at school so that they can be at GSA. And the other thing I want to mention is that students report feelings of safety whether they attend the club or not. Anecdotally, we've heard from students that say, I can't be at GSA, I've either got too much going on or I don't feel, like I can be out to that level, whether as a gay student or as a straight ally. But just knowing that there's a club in the school, students tell us that they feel much better and they feel a lot safer. So, so even for those students who don't go to GSA, it makes a difference. As Michael was talking about in his advice, teach about it. From our 2009 Wisconsin School Climate Survey, we know that students who see or saw positive portrayals of LGBT people, history, and events in the classroom, they were also less likely to have skipped school due to not feeling safe. They reported higher academic performance and had higher future educational aspirations than those who did not. It's really important to find age-appropriate ways to teach about it. It's absolutely appropriate to talk about LGBT issues in the classroom, and it's not necessarily a controversial issue because, again, sexual identity is different from sexual behavior. Gender identity is different from sexual behavior. So when you're talking about LGBT history, when you're talking about LGBT people and events, you're not talking about sex. It's not controversial in that way. So it is appropriate to talk about it. And it can be done at the elementary classroom. I mentioned a couple of different resources to help with that. I also want to point out that, teaching about differences, whether that's be teaching about differences based on race or religion or different ability or immigrant status, etc., including teaching about gay and lesbian people, that type of anti-bias training is a really important part of anti-bullying education. When we understand about people's differences, we're oftentimes less likely to treat other people poorly. So, and again, the less we talk about it, the worse it gets. Again, anti-gay bullying harassment is happening in your school. You do have gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender students who may be suffering and may be feeling like they have no support. So it really is important to talk about it because it's only going to get worse if we don't. So that's kind of the end of our training at this point. I want to point out that I'm available for consultation and training, as well as other folks from my organization, GSA for Safe Schools. For more information, you can contact me. You can see the contact information there on the screen. I want to thank you for your time today. I believe I'm passing it back over to Joan now.
At this point, I'd like to thank Brian J. for being with us today. I think it took tremendous courage for Michael and Andy to be with us today and to address a lot of really important issues for us for now and for the future. If you have any comments regarding this webcast or any suggestions on future school safety topics, please call me, and my contact number, phone number, and email is on the screen. I'd like for you to know that our Safe Schools webcasts are archived at our DPI media link, that they can be viewed at your convenience at any time. Thank you very much for being with us today.